Nesbit Halloween special. Thank you for being here. Today is going to be part 1 of a 9-part series on Friday the 13th. Typically, when one looks at Friday the 13th, you break it down into 9 movies, because Jason X doesn't count. The first 3 movies are typically called the Origin Trilogy, while 4, 5, and 6 are a trilogy of their own featuring a character named Tommy Jarvis. And 7, 8, and 9 are called the Supernatural Trilogy, or when they just start doing weird shit because it doesn't make sense. So let's take a look at the movie that started it all, the original Friday the 13th.
So the movie starts at Camp Crystal Lake in the 50s. A couple of kids are fooling around, and then they get killed. Originally for this review, I wanted to do parts 1, 2, and 3 at once. However, time constraints weren't going to allow that. There's so much I wanted to touch upon. So we're just going to focus on part 1 to begin. In my opinion, it's really a masterpiece in cinema horror, and we'll get into that. Flash forward to Friday the 13th, the present, meaning 1980. So the film begins with one of the counselors getting a ride to the camp, and they start talking about what happened in the 50s with the counselors getting killed, and I'm done with the goofy voice. But they add in a little bit more in the exposition about how a kid drowned, and how the townspeople now aren't entirely happy with the camp being reopened. Normally exposition for me doesn't work, but here it does because it's small pieces, and we've already seen some of what's gone on, so it's not overbearing and, explaining every little thing. Okay, skipping ahead a little bit, we're going to meet some of the other counselors. By the way, that guy refused to drive her all the way to the camp, left her at a crossroads. That'll be important later. One of the things you're going to notice with the early Friday the 13th films, and horror movies really in the 70s and 80s in general, is that when you meet these characters, they're all likable. They may not all be fully fleshed out, three-dimensional characters, but they're likable. And that's something that I think is really missing. A lot of horror movies that I've seen, especially from the late 90s to now, the one thing that always sticks out is you genuinely hate most, if not all, the characters. So it's not about caring for these characters. It turns into kind of a game of which asshole's going to get killed first. Where here, you genuinely like these people. I mean, they're all likable. There's no one with overly bearing flaws or a real reason to get killed. And I think that's missing, is that vulnerability, that connection we have with these characters in horror films. And yes, that is a Kevin Bacon. Oddly enough, it wasn't Animal House that got his career going. It was his very small part in this movie that jumpstarted his career. Back to our lone counselor making her way to the camp, and oh look, she's hitchhiking, and you can't see the driver. You know what that means. Yep, she's dead. Now this movie has a slower pace compared to, say, your modern horror films, and one of the things they do is they show the people bonding and having fun. Now they do this in a way that I think is better than what modern horror films do. One I saw recently, and I can't remember the name of it was, had a similar scene like this, except it was set to cheesy jazz music and there was no talking. You couldn't hear the dialogue. Where here, you could definitely hear them. They're having fun, they're friends, they're getting along, and they're likable. I keep going back to this likability. Meanwhile, say from the cover of forest, someone is watching them.
You have to remember that at this point, Jason hasn't been established. When you think of Friday the 13th, you think of Jason. But this one treated itself more of a murder mystery. Who's killing the people? Is it the one that killed the snake? Is it the head counselor, Mr. Christie? Who could be killing people?
Hey, Sammy, have you seen my Halloween costume?
This is a good time to bring up the character Old Ralph. Old Ralph is the town drunk and doomsayer. Is he trying to help the kids? Is he trying to kill them? You have to find out. Now would be a good time to introduce you to the characters. You got Ned.
Oh shit.
You got Marcy and Jack. Bill. Mr. Christie. Brenda. And Alice. You've already met Annie. The first character that we really get to know who dies is Ned. which is unfortunate. Ned is probably one of my favorite characters in the entire series of movies. Just because he's fun, he doesn't mean any harm, he's a nice guy. The death itself is somewhat underwhelming. He just sees someone at the cabin, he goes and checks it out. You actually don't know that he's dead until a little bit later, but I'm counting this as the actual death because you don't see him from this point on. Something else I want to point out in this movie is the cinematography. That is a tricky shot. And yes, that is the actual killer. Using just a leaf, they were able to cover the killer's face. Awesome. So Jack and Marcy go back to fool around. And while they're fooling around in the bunk, it pans up. And what do we see? Ned! So when they're done, Marcy runs off to the bathroom. Meanwhile, all the other counselors are playing Monopoly in another cabin, leaving Jack here to smoke a doobie all by himself with the corpse of Ned, which will start to drop blood on him. When that happens, as such, he finds out, somehow the killer knows, and all of a sudden, she ruins Kevin Bacon. As I said, the others are playing Monopoly while this is going on. Not just any Monopoly, strip Monopoly. Oh, Brenda, you hussy. You hussy. So you got Marcy here kind of doing her thing in the bathroom. Thinks she hears something, decides to wash her face, then hears something again, goes to check it out, acts in the face.
If it seems like I'm going through a lot here and skipping some things, you have to understand again, we're looking at it in a 9-part series. When we get to part 3, I'm really going to talk about the 3 movies as a whole and go back over them and what they did right in that particular trilogy. What we're really trying to get through here is just the dynamics of the movie. The movie in itself, nowadays, is pretty much a standard horror film. But really, this and Halloween is what set that standard.
Sammy, I need my Halloween costume for the review.
So the group decides it's raining too hard or something to continue playing Strip Monopoly. So Brenda takes off to her cabin by herself. Meanwhile, Mr. Christie's at a diner for some reason hanging out with a transvestite waitress. Brenda's back at her cabin now by herself, and she thinks she hears a noise, so she goes outside to investigate. She ends up on the archery range, where someone ends up turning on the lights, and again, this is one of those deaths that you don't see on camera, which is very interesting. They did the same thing for her and Ned, because they always hinted that those two had a thing going for each other, so I thought that was kind of a nice tie-in between the two characters. So Bill and Alice start to get a little concerned about what's going on. They haven't been able to find anybody or seeing anybody. And then they notice the archery lights are on. So they go to investigate. Upon investigating, they do find an axe in one of the beds. Not being the typical idiots, they decide to call for help. But once you know it, when they go to use the phone, of course, the wire has been severed. In another surprisingly smart move, they tried to leave to get help using the car. Unfortunately, the engine has been tampered with. Meanwhile, Mr. Christie got a ride back with the police officer because his vehicle wasn't working too well either. The police officer got a call to go somewhere else, so he couldn't take Mr. Christie all the way into camp. On his way there, Mr. Christie runs into someone that he knows and acknowledges right before that person kills him. To make matters worse, the generator has stopped working at this point, so Bill decides to light a few lanterns and go check it out himself, mainly because Alice is sleeping. Having woke up because of nightmare, Alice can't find Bill, realizes he's at the generator, and decides to go there and find him herself. However, when she gets to the generator, she doesn't see him. Oh wait, there he is. So Alice runs back to the main cabin where she has a completely gone batshit meltdown, which is completely understandable. This is actually a very believable scene. Goes on maybe a little bit longer than I would like, but she completely loses her shit. After she barricades herself inside the cabin, she thinks that she's safe and she's wondering where everyone is. Well, there they are. So whoever the killer is now throwing the bodies through the windows. Now Alice saw a car outside. She's going to unbarricade herself and try to run outside to safety, thinking that the car is Mr. Christie coming back. Instead, it's some crazy lady who we've never seen before. We find out that this woman is Pamela Voorhees. She used to work in the camp back in the 50s. Her son drowned there, because two of the counselors were having sex. That's a really bad camp. That if two of the counselors are missing, kids start drowning, you have bigger problems on your hands. The last act of this movie is just Alice and Pamela Voorhees fighting. They're running around the camp. Pamela's trying to kill Alice. Alice is trying to keep herself alive. I want to note at this point that in 1980 the Razzies were invented. Now that's an award for terrible movies and terrible acting. The woman who plays Pamela Voorhees' name is Betsy Palmer. She was nominated and won the 1980 Razzie. I find that very, very ironic that 25 years later this movie is still very much a part of the culture. And the Razzies were off. Now the Razzies are typically really good about picking out bad movies. I'm just going to chalk that up to it's the first year, and then let's be honest, the late 70s, early 80s was an awesome time for movies. The climax of the movie culminates where Alice thinks that she's killed or knocked out Pamela Voorhees. Not quite the case. It comes down to a battle on the beach where Alice takes Mrs. Voorhees' head. And finally everything is okay. The final mystery of the movie is, who was the boy that pulled her into the lake? We'll have to find that answer in Friday the 13th Part 2 in our next special. Don't worry, it won't be a full year for you to see the next review. I plan on 9 months of Halloween. As a bonus, let's look at all the deaths that happened in the movie.
Hi. What are you doing out in this mess?
Honey, have you seen my Halloween costume? You're wearing it. You're wearing my Halloween costume. Why are you doing that?
Honey, I haven't seen your costume.
Who the fuck are you?